The fever took Eli Mercer in the dead of winter when the land was too hard to bury a man, and the sky didn't care if you lived or died. He lay in his cabin counting the cracks in the ceiling, knowing every one of them by name, knowing the land outside would outlast him. 3 days earlier, he'd been strong enough to work, strong enough to feed his horses, check the cattle, split wood for the stove. Then the cold hit him like a fist, sudden, brutal, unforgiving. His legs went weak first, then his arms. Then his mind started playing tricks, making him see things that weren't there. The tin above his stove held $3, not enough for medicine, not enough for the doctor who charged $5 just to ride out from town. Eli did the math over and over, hoping it would change. It never did. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And kindly give this video a like. When Silas Crowe knocked on his door, Eli knew what it meant. Nothing good ever came from a visit by Crowe. The man owned half the town, the bank, the land office, the store where desperate people signed their lives away in credit. He dressed too fine for this country, smiled too wide, spoke in the language of business while dealing in theft. Crowe placed papers on Eli's table. A loan, enough money for medicine and food. The collateral was simple: the land. Just temporary security, Crowe said. Pay it back in 6 months with 20% interest, and the paper means nothing. 20%. Eli's fever-clouded mind tried to calculate what that meant, but the numbers swam and blurred. His hands shook as he signed. Crowe left him with coins and laudanum and the growing certainty of a terrible mistake. But mistakes made in desperation don't reveal themselves immediately. They wait. They grow in darkness, like disease. The medicine kept Eli alive through winter, but barely. He could walk to the barn and back. He could feed the horses, but the strength never returned to his arms. He couldn't rope, couldn't ride hard, couldn't do the work that ranching demanded. The cattle scattered across the territory, unfed and uncounted. Some probably died. Others were likely stolen. The rest simply disappeared into the vastness. Spring came grudgingly, melting the snow to reveal dead grass and mud. Eli finally read the contract with clear eyes. The words that were blurred before now stood sharp and damning. The interest compounded weekly. The payment had been due 2 weeks ago, and buried in legal language he hadn't understood. Failure to pay meant transfer of ownership. All land, all structures, all livestock, everything. Crowe arrived with 6 men, some carrying rifles. He had papers signed by the sheriff. Legal and proper, he claimed. The men spread across Eli's property like locusts, cataloging everything, marking his horses with new brands, nailing notices to his barn. Eli stood on his porch, watching his life be dismantled, his father's land, his father's grave on the hill overlooking the valley, all of it passing into Crowe's hands while the law looked the other way and the town pretended not to see. Crowe offered him a choice: stay on as a laborer and pay rent, or ride out with nothing. Eli had nowhere to go and no strength to get there anyway, so he stayed in the cabin that was no longer his, on the land he'd lost, surrounded by men who guarded against him, stealing back what had been stolen from him. This was the bottom, lower than the fever, lower than poverty. This was erasure. The darkness that followed wasn't the darkness of night. It was the darkness of a man realizing he'd been beaten by paper and law, and his own desperate signature. Eli sat in his cabin without lighting the lamp, listening to Crowe's men laugh around their campfire, and thought about simply walking into the hills and never coming back. Then Clara Dane arrived. She came at dawn in a simple wagon pulled by a single mule. She wore traveling clothes and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd survived worse than this country could offer. When Crowe's men tried to stop her at the property line, she drove past them as if they were weather, unavoidable but not worth acknowledging. She entered Eli's cabin without asking permission, carrying bags and bundles. A neighbor named Tom Hutchins had sent word months ago that Eli might need help, she explained. Tom had died of pneumonia before she could come, but a promise to a dead man still counted for something. Eli told her he couldn't pay. She told him she hadn't asked for money. He said he didn't need charity. She told him to stop being stubborn and let someone help him before he died of spite. Clara moved through that cabin like inevitability itself, patient, relentless, utterly indifferent to protest. She brewed teas that tasted like punishment but settled his stomach. She made him walk, then walk farther, then work his arms with light weights. She cooked meals from provisions she'd brought and game she trapped. She cleaned wounds on his hands he hadn't known had festered. In the evenings, she read to him from a worn book of poems, her voice steady and uncommenting. Days became weeks. Eli's color returned. His hands steadied. His appetite came back. The fog that had wrapped around his mind since winter began to lift. And through it all, Clara asked nothing, explained nothing, simply persisted in keeping him alive. 2 weeks in, Eli finally asked why she was doing this. Clara told him about her husband and 2 children, all taken by fever in a single summer. She'd buried everyone she loved and learned what it cost to give up, what it cost to keep going. Eli had been doing neither, she said, just existing in between. He told her everything then, the sickness, the contract, Crowe's takeover, the town's silence. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she retrieved the contract from where it lay forgotten on a shelf. She read through the night, and she found what Crowe had counted on. No one finding the fatal flaw in his theft. Clara had been married to a county clerk. She knew filing systems, legal requirements, the technical language of territorial law, and Crowe's contract violated that law in multiple ways. It required a neutral witness to the signature, not Crowe's own employee. It required a 3-day consideration period. It required proper documentation of property value. Crowe had done none of it. More than that, Clara discovered something else. She walked the property line with a survey map, pacing distances, examining fence posts. The land Crowe had claimed included 60 acres of territorial property that Eli had never owned. Land that couldn't be used as collateral because it had never been legally deeded. The entire seizure was built on sand, but knowing the law was broken and enforcing it were different things. Crowe owned the sheriff, owned half the town, owned the men who would be called to enforce any judgment. Local power trumped distant law, except for one thing, the territorial judge. Judge Warren rode circuit through these towns, beholden to no one, with a reputation for following the letter of the law, regardless of who it hurt. He'd be in town in 4 days. Clara spread the papers across the table and met Eli's eyes. He had to be strong enough to face Crowe in that courtroom, strong enough to ride into town and make his case, strong enough to risk everything on the chance that law might actually matter. 4 days. Eli had 4 days to become the man he'd been before winter broke him. He worked every morning before dawn, pushing his body past where it wanted to stop. Clara pushed him harder, never cruel, but never gentle either. She understood that recovery wasn't just about healing. It was about proving to yourself that you could survive the pain of getting stronger. On the 4th day, they rode into town. Eli on a borrowed horse, his back straight despite the lingering weakness. Clara beside him with the legal documents in a leather case. People stopped and stared. Eli Mercer, who they'd thought was finished, returned from the dead. The courthouse was packed. Judge Warren sat behind a rough-hewn bench, gray-bearded and severe. Crowe sat with his lawyer, confident and smiling. He'd done this before, many times. The law had always bent his way. Crowe's lawyer presented first, speaking in practiced rhythms about contractual obligations, the sanctity of debt, proper legal procedure. He made it sound reasonable. He made it sound like justice. Then Clara stood, and she dismantled Crowe's case piece by piece. She presented evidence of the missing neutral witness. She documented the lack of a consideration period. She unfolded the survey map and showed how Crowe had claimed territorial land he had no right to seize. She spoke in the precise language of law, citing statutes, referencing territorial codes, leaving no room for interpretation. Crowe's lawyer objected, calling these minor procedural issues. Clara corrected him. These weren't issues, they were violations. Crowe himself stood and protested, claiming good faith. The judge told him to sit down. Minutes passed in silence as Judge Warren read through the documents. The room held its breath. Paper rustled, the judge's expression darkened. Finally, he looked up and spoke the words that changed everything. The contract is void. Multiple violations of territorial lending law, fraudulent property boundaries. The seizure was illegal from the start. Eli's property was restored immediately. Crowe would return all livestock, all equipment, all improvements. He would pay court costs. And if the judge ever saw Crowe in his court again, for practices like these, he'd find the judge far less charitable. The gavel fell. Just like that, on paper, Eli Mercer got his life back. But paper and reality were different things. Crowe had to actually return what he'd taken. The town had to actually acknowledge what had happened. And Eli had to figure out how to live on land that felt different now, marked by loss even in restoration. Crowe left the courthouse in fury, making vague threats that everyone heard but no one could act on. Clara met his eyes and told him plainly, "The law doesn't favor vultures. Find your meals elsewhere." The crowd dispersed. A few people nodded to Eli, not quite apologies, but acknowledgments. The town had learned that sometimes the distant law mattered more than local power. Sometimes the weak could win. Sometimes justice actually happened. 2 weeks later, Eli stood in his barn, working with movements that were still careful but gaining strength. The horses were back. New cattle grazed beyond the fence. The land looked the same as it had before winter, but Eli saw it differently now. Clara worked nearby, mending a bridle. She'd stayed after the trial. Not as a guest, not as a nurse, as something else that neither of them had quite named yet. And that's when Eli made the offer that would define what came next. The land was too much for one person. He'd learned that the hard way. He needed a partner, someone who knew law, knew medicine, knew when he was being stubborn. He wasn't offering charity or asking her to stay out of obligation. He was offering equal partnership, equal say, equal work, equal everything. Clara set down her work and looked at him steadily. She didn't need rescuing, she said. She'd done the rescuing. But partnership, that was different. That was two people choosing to face the land together instead of alone. She'd buried everything she loved in Nebraska, thought she was done with making homes, with trusting land to hold her. But maybe that was its own kind of sickness. Maybe survival meant being willing to try again. It wasn't a yes, it was a maybe working toward yes. They'd see if he could handle a woman with opinions, she said. They'd see if she could trust another piece of ground not to become a graveyard. Because that's what survival actually looks like. Not certainty, but the willingness to risk uncertainty again. The sun set over Eli's land. Their land now, maybe. The horses settled in the corral. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called and another answered. The eternal conversation of a country that didn't care whether people lived or died, but held space for both. Tom Hutchins used to say, "The land doesn't care if you live or die, but if you live right, it'll outlast your dying." Eli had thought that meant working hard, building things, leaving a mark. Now he understood it meant something else. Living right meant knowing when to ask for help, meant reading the contracts before you signed them, meant standing up when the law failed and making it work anyway, meant finding partnership instead of fighting alone, meant understanding that the land didn't belong to you. You belonged to it, temporarily, and what mattered was what you did with that temporary time. Eli Mercer had lost everything and gotten it back. But what he'd gotten back wasn't the same as what he'd lost. It was better, harder won, built on understanding instead of inheritance, shared instead of owned alone. The land remained, and on it, two people who'd learned that survival isn't the same as living, but sometimes survival is exactly where living begins. The fever had taken Eli in winter. Spring had stolen his land. Summer had given it back. And fall would bring the real work, the work of building something that could outlast them both. Not through ownership, but through stewardship. Not through isolation, but through partnership. The ranch stood against the mountains, small and stubborn, and absolutely insignificant to the vastness around it. But significance wasn't the point. Persistence was, the willingness to keep going when everything said to quit, the stubbornness to fight even when the fight seemed lost. That cabin, those horses, that land, they'd outlast Eli and Clara both, but for however long they had, they'd make it mean something, they'd make it count, they'd live right, and the land, indifferent as always, would hold them while they did.